It Chapter 2, released in 2019, continues the story of the Losers Club 27 years after their first confrontation with Pennywise. Now adults, the group returns to Derry after the creature resurfaces, forcing them to confront their fears, trauma, and memories they thought they had left behind. While the film expands the mythology of Pennywise with a larger scale and darker emotional themes, its core remains centered on friendship, unresolved childhood trauma, and the idea that some fears can only be defeated by facing them directly.
What's up, folks, and welcome back to another episode of So You Like Horror. Sorry, I'm a little out of breath. I just got done working out, because I'm trying to get all strong and shit. So today was a weird day as I got to record because this episode goes out on Friday, and today it is Thursday, and I also had to work out, and then I had jiu-jitsu, so I had to, basically 2 out of the 3 things are going to happen. Either I'm going to record and go to jiu-jitsu and not work out, or work out and record and not do jiu-jitsu, or work out and go to jiu-jitsu and not record. Well, that one's not an option. So I worked out. I'm a little winded. So here we are, though. But yeah, thanks as always for coming back, because we do appreciate you. And if this is your first time, thanks for checking it out, because we do appreciate that as well. And, it's me. It's Dante. So we got you. So, as you all may know, having listened to at least 2 out of the last 3 episodes, we'd been talking about Welcome to Derry, and then we did It in 2017. So, just figure, let's just go ahead and, get it all out the way and do It Chapter 2. So, that's where we're at. Wasn't even part of the plan. The actual original plan was Welcome to Derry, and then we're going to move on to, I can't even remember what the original plan was from there. And then we're going to be doing True Blood. True Blood is still going to happen. It's just going to be in 2 weeks. So, or maybe a week. I don't know. We'll see how I feel. What's today's date? Today's 20th, so 21st. Maybe. We'll see. Either way, True Blood is next. But before we get to True Blood, we got to get through It Chapter 2. So, as usual, for those who have been here, we're not doing a scene-by-scene retelling of the movie. I don't find myself to be the best storyteller when it comes to something like this, just because memories and CTE is real. But I do have tons of notes, and I'm just going to try to keep them in order this time. But yeah, we'll go through it as it has been done before, just kind of going through really act by act, more so than anything. So, you get kind of a basic gist of the story, and then, we'll talk about some themes and just thoughts on the movie itself. So, for those of you who may not know, when it was released in 2017. Well, first off, the book itself, the novel, the Stephen King book, is fucking huge. It's a big book. I ain't read that shit. I ain't even do the audiobook. It's fucking a lot. But, when you look at something like that, it's like, well, you kind of almost can't really do it in one movie. That's why in 1990, when they did the miniseries, I mean, that was a long fucking thing too. Every time I see it pop up on HBO, I'm like, nah, we good. We don't need to revisit. But for the remake, when they dropped it in 2017, they basically split the book up into 2 essentially. So It Chapter 2 comes out 2 years after the other movie, and in terms of just time, it takes place 27 years later, obviously, because that's the cycle of it, or the entity, or the creature, or whatever you want, Pennywise, whatever it is. But what we'll end up with is the members of the Losers Club. They're adults now, and just about everyone from that group has left Derry. Well, everyone did leave except for Mike. So I guess when I say just about everyone, it really is everyone bounced, and then Mike stuck around. Everybody left. They built a new life, and they pretty much forgot just about everything that happened during that summer where Pennywise, came through and did the Pennywise stuff. But now here we are 27 years later, and basically Pennywise is back. And the only one that stayed behind was Mike. And he's basically been kind of staying around waiting and preparing for this. So, like I said, the first movie was the first movie took place back in 1990 or 89, 90, 89, whatever it may be. I can't remember fucking numbers, but they're all children, and the movie was largely about children discovering what scared them, and realizing that as a group, as a together, they could face those fears. Now, chapter 2, it kind of gives you kind of a different spin. It asks the question, like, what happens when those kids become adults, but they never really dealt with things that happened to them. So, you kind of see that when you get to the adult part of them, and all the stuff that, we remember from the first movie, those, characters still carry it as adults. So for this episode, I want to move through the movie act by act, kind of touching on the major plot points while looking at the adult versions of the losers, and kind of breaking them down some. We want to talk about, obviously, Pennywise's return, Derry's continued cycle of violence, and folks either ignoring it or forgetting it, not being aware of it, whatever it may be, childhood trauma carried into adulthood, and the ritual of Chüd, and kind of, I guess, at the end of this all, kind of discuss whether this sequel or follow-up gives the story kind of a satisfying ending to the larger story, because it's obviously going to be different from the book and even the original 1990 miniseries, but that's how it goes. Because if you pull a Gus Van Sant and reshoot Psycho, the same exact way the original Psycho was, what fun is that? You don't really get anything different other than Vince Vaughn and Anne Heche, but that's not what most remakes do. They like to kind of expand on the story and give us points of views that we hadn't seen before, stuff like that. So anyhow, that's me just kind of giving our little ramble before we get into things. So as we get into Act 1, the film starts at the Derry's Canal Days Festival, and you have character Adrian Mellon and his boyfriend Don. And after leaving the carnival, they get attacked. Now, while they're at the carnival, they're talking and exchanging, and they're actually confronted by one of the kids there. And, they start slinging slurs around, that heavy F slur specifically. Very, very heavy. So after they leave the carnival, they actually get attacked. And Adrian gets beaten pretty badly and then thrown from the bridge into the water below. Now, before Don can save Adrian, Pennywise appears and kills Adrian. And, it's already starting early on. It's important, to have Pennywise here too, because again, as we all know, Pennywise is not actively doing the bad things. He's feeding off of it though. So, and feeding, I guess kind of infecting the folks around. So, as bad things happen, Pennywise is kind of there to pick up the scraps. So Pennywise is not directly responsible, I guess, for the physical violence that starts the story. Humans are, essentially. So Pennywise, like I said, is kind of there to take advantage of it. So 20 years may have passed, but like Derry's still the same town that we saw back in chapter 1 and back in Welcome to Derry, season 1 back in 1962. So ain't nothing changed. The cruelty can happen openly while everyone else seems to just look away. So like this opening reminds us that Pennywise, like, again, isn't the only source of evil in Derry. Like, Adrian is attacked by people before Pennywise even appears. And again, just kind of remind us that cruelty, prejudice, violence exist inside of this small town. And like I said, Pennywise kind of encourages, I guess, or like I would say infects people, and feeds, and from there he feeds on the darkness. So 27 years after the first film, things are still, the same. People are still willing to ignore what happens around them. And this continues the pattern of passive adults and community indifference. So after Welcome to Derry, this feels even more important because we now understand that these cycles of violence, they've existed for generations. And this makes Pennywise's return feel less like an isolated event and more like another chapter in Derry's long history of looking the other way and just being like, oh, it's just business as usual. So at this point in the story, Mike Hanlon is the only member of the Losers, still around, waiting. Like he had been plotting this whole time and studying, trying to figure out, what are we going to do. So while everyone else kind of, like I said, moved on and slowly figured out what happened, Mike could, and I don't know, I feel like, again, from the first movie, Ben was the historian, and I believe that's changed from the book where Mike was. And it would make sense then to kind of keep that same energy if he was the historian, in the first one, and then he stuck around and kind of, kept studying and looking into all this. It all would have made sense. Doesn't make it all bad. It's just an observation there. But basically, yeah, he spends, the two decades plus researching the town, documenting the history, waiting to see whether, Pennywise would return. Because, for them, the only thing they have to go off of is really their experiences. Sure, they might be able to kind of track back, and see some things going on, but really no signs of Pennywise itself. But, here we are now, 27 years later, and he sees the pattern repeating itself. So Adrian's death kind of confirms what Mike feared. The 27-year cycle was about to kick back off. And, that means it's time to make some phone calls and honor a promise that they all made as children. So, with Mike being the only member of the Losers Club who stayed in Derry, this leaves him carrying the burden of remembering everything the others were able to forget. So during all this time, like, his life is pretty much shaped by researching Pennywise, studying Derry's history, and waiting for the creature to return, or it to return, or Pennywise to return, or whatever it may be. And that kind of brings up the question of whether he even truly had a life outside of that responsibility himself, because you don't really get into that part of the story now. It's not really important, I guess, maybe. In terms of family, kids. I mean, I guess it is kind of guessed or assumed that, he doesn't have a family. You don't hear any mention of it anyway. So, but, the rest of the gang, they physically escape. And like I said, it's not even like that, they stopped caring. It's just again, the memories kind of faded for them. they lost those memories. So Mike, he's forced to live with the trauma. And I guess that's part of what it is though too. They left Derry and those memories went away. Whereas Mike stayed and, he's forced to live with the trauma every day. And in that sense, I guess you could say he sacrificed more than anyone else in the group because he gives up decades of his life to make sure someone remembers, what went down. And also just kind of on a somewhat educated guess, maybe a theory, Pennywise is coming back. So he gave up a lot to be there and ready for it. But again, you need the gang, you need them all. So it isn't so much like, okay, I'm gonna stick around and do this because he can't do it by himself. But as I mentioned, everyone else leaving, this is where we kind of find out, well, at least my notes here have what everybody else was up to. So, Mike starts making the phone calls. And these calls kind of give you an opportunity to see, what did happen to all the kids after the first movie. And one of the most interesting things, about chapter 2 is that nearly every adult loser has created a life shaped by the fears and trauma that they experienced as children. So, you have Bill, and he's a successful writer and a screenwriter, I guess author and screenwriter, but he's constantly criticized for not knowing how to end his stories. And, it kind of works also as a Stephen King joke, but it also fits Bill perfectly. Like Bill, he spent his entire life looking for an end to something that began with Georgie, disappearing. So he still carries that guilt over, from his brother's death 27 years ago. Then you got Eddie. He works in risk assessment, and with his history just being kind of that kid that was, well, his mother made him believe that he was always sick, and he was fragile, that makes perfect sense. And even better, like he married a woman who behaves almost exactly like his mother. And fun fact, the woman that's his wife in chapter 2 is the same woman that played his mother in the first one. So little fun thing there I actually just stumbled upon accidentally. I didn't even actually find that, that information on my own. I was watching some shit on YouTube and some dude pointed that shit. I was like, oh shit, I didn't even notice. Like I watched the movie, 3 times since Friday, and then you pick it up because, that's just what I do. Fuck y'all. Anyhow, but basically, yeah, he ends up marrying someone that is essentially his mom. And, again, he's that kid that was raised to believe that everything was dangerous. And he built an adult life around calculating danger and just, trying to, kind of foresee those things. Then you get Richie, and Richie, was always a dude cracking jokes. And, he turned that defense mechanism into a career. He became a stand-up comedian. The kid who was constantly using humor to hide fear now is a successful comedian, Richie Trashmouth. Like he he's grown up, but, he's still making jokes and still kind of using that as kind of a way to keep people from seeing what really makes them vulnerable. So I don't know. Like I like also shout out to, the casting, because it's like all the kids who, appeared in the first movie. When you look at the second movie, all the actors, kind of look similar to them. And from what I understand, I think like they, they're asking the kids who, they think should play them, I guess, as adults possibly. And, I guess they took some of those ideals and ran with it. And I believe the kids were even, they even wrote letters to the adult cast members, and that kind of helped them, get into character and mode to the younger individuals and become them as adults. Then we get Ben, who I always forget that Stand By Me is a Stephen King book, because I always like watching the movie, and then you see the transformation from, the fat kid to like this guy that's in shape and good looking. And in my mind, I was like, oh, it's like the fat kid from Stand By Me, like Jerry O'Connell. And then you see Jerry O'Connell like as an adult. I was like, oh, like you really filled out, buddy. And then it was like, I was like, oh yeah, I forgot that is a Stephen King work, Stand By Me. So maybe that was intentional. But Ben is now a successful architect, and again, looks completely different, from the overweight kid that was bullied from that first movie. So from the outside, Ben appears to have it all together. He's reinvented himself. You think, oh, perfect, but he still has emotional insecurities, back from those days. Then you got Stanley Uris, like he's now like kind of built a stable life, it's structured, what he's always wanted. But after he gets the call from Mike and remember what happened in Derry, he removed himself from the board. And it's interesting because knowing that information and then watching the first movie and seeing how Pennywise basically almost ate this dude's head. And then you see, in the second one, chapter 2, where he takes his own life. What I took from that, and you kind of get this. He writes letters to everyone, and they read them later on. But I took it as like, that shit scared him so much. He knew he was going to be able to handle that again. And I get that. It's like you don't want to be the cause for their not succeeding. So it's like, let me just go on and get out of here. Plus, I mean, dude, Pennywise, you're like inside Pennywise's mouth. So you're like right there on the doorstep. So yeah, I get it. But you get Stanley, and again, he grew up in, even just ironically, his wife, as the scene enters, his wife is like booking like, tickets for them to go on vacation. So it's like, you got stuff to look forward to. And, he gets that call and he was like, nah, I'm not here for that. Then we move on to Beverly, and she's become professionally successful, but she's still trapped in that abusive like mindset, and she's in an abusive marriage. Her husband's controlling, he's violent. And this creates an obvious parallel with her relationship to her father, from the first movie. And like, it's just ironic because Beverly escaped Derry, but like she didn't completely escape the patterns that Derry created for her. So the adult losers show that leaving Derry, it didn't necessarily mean escaping what happened there. Like Bill still has this drive, of guilt and responsibility. Beverly is, still repeating patterns of abuse. Eddie, he continues organizing his life around fear. Richie hides his vulnerabilities behind humor, and Bill still not Bill, that fucking the entire time doing all these notes, I kept writing Bill for Ben and Ben for Bill. I'm gonna do better, y'all. I got you. But Ben still carries like his insecurities of being a lonely kid. Being a new kid, being lonely, being picked on, just all that stuff. He's still carrying those insecurities. So their lives suggest that childhood trauma, it can continue shaping behavior and relationships, even when the memories themselves kind of faded away and they don't have just those thoughts. But that's kind of what we get here. And the adult casting helps reinforce those connections. Like with Bill Hader, like playing Richie, it's perfect. It's perfect. It really stands out. And especially like even like the communication and chemistry between the cast, it feels very much like the kids, so they all did a fantastic job. I think, they did a good job, like capturing, not only like the mannerisms, but also like those like emotional defense like mechanisms and everything established from the first film. So that, again, shout out to, whoever cast this movie. I liked it. We also get Henry Bowers, kind of in between all this, we find out that Henry Bowers, he spent the last 27 years institutionalized. Now, you do get kind of this flashback to him kind of washing through, I guess, the sewer system and coming out and then getting questioned about the death of his father or the murder of his father. And, we get that bit, kind of filling in the blanks, I guess. And with Pennywise awake again, Henry is kind of pulled back into the story and kind of uses his, I guess, vessel. Like Pennywise gives him his old knife back and sends him after the kids or the losers. Like at some point, Henry's going to attack Eddie, and later on he's going to go after Mike, stuff like that. Those are kind of the two big attacks. But the story is going to continue this idea that Pennywise doesn't always need to attack directly. Sometimes humans, are perfectly capable of doing the violence for it. So, like, Henry's return in this movie, just kind of solidifies that. And I don't know. I think there is kind of a weird thing with Henry because I don't know that it's majorly important, but it is. I think it didn't need a whole lot of shine. I don't think it got too much shine, but it still felt like we could have did without Henry. Perhaps you could have used, someone else in modern times, for that representation. Like, even though like Pennywise influences Henry and pushes him towards chasing after the losers, like Henry still, he's still can't speak, responsible for his choices because he's fucked up. And he has a violent, past with, his father and everything. So that violent behavior, it still exists, long before Pennywise even, got involved. But I think you could have still utilized, someone else maybe. And I get the importance of Henry Bowers being used, but I also feel like maybe we didn't really need that part, perhaps. I don't know. Like, that's why I'm not a screenwriter, because I look at it like probably didn't need it, but maybe, when you look at it in the bigger picture, they did feel like they needed it. Like, I feel like Henry's subplot feels somewhat disconnected from the larger story, because again, his attacks on Eddie and Mike are kind of resolved very quickly and have like little impact on the final confrontation. So because the sequel already has so much stuff going on, so many characters and storylines to manage, like some of Henry's screen time could have been used to further develop like Mike, because he does kind of disappear for a minute. Stan, even though he takes his own life, there could have been a little bit more added there. Any of them, you could use that screen time that you did with Henry for other stuff, but that's just my thought. Well, whether it's worth anything or not. So, as we get everybody back in Derry, the surviving losers, like Discount and Stan, obviously, they all meet up at, I think, what was it called? The Jade of the Orient, Chinese restaurant. So at first, everything seems cool. Everybody's getting along. Everybody's cracking jokes. You got Eddie and Richie obviously kind of riffing off each other. That's super cool. You got Bill and Beverly, cozying up to each other. It all seems right. Everything seems cool. They drink, they joke, they remember childhood stories, and they slowly kind of reconnect and discover, not discover, but rediscover friendship. But everything kind of gets uncomfortable real fast when, they get a message from Pennywise through the fortune cookies about Stanley not being able to make the cut. They learn about Stan's death, and a message was formed through it. I believe Bev already knew, but everybody kind of finds out collectively, the rest of them at least, through the fortune cookies saying, looks like Stanley couldn't make the cut. And then the fortune cookies start turning into like little creatures and scary monsters and shit. And the fucked up thing is they're the only ones that's seeing it. Like, they're the only ones that know what's going on. Like, we know this because when the hostess comes back in, Mike is beating the shit out of the table, and like, everyone else sees it. Well, the losers see it, but like the hostess, she's like, "What the fuck?" And then Richie, just in Richie fashion, real quick, is like, "Yeah, can we get the check?" But as they're leaving, Richie has an encounter with a kid who we later find out his name is Dean, and he lives in Bill's old house. The kid says to Richie, "The fun's just beginning," and it comes off as almost like a threat. And Richie kind of starts going off on this kid, and he was like, "Dude, relax. I'm a fucking fan." Well, he didn't say fucking fan, but he was like, "I'm a fan." So, you get that kind of, introduction of this character that you're going to see later on. But we also see now the paranoia is setting in, and, folks are on edge, specifically, Richie in this moment. So as we kind of exit out and move from there, Bev reaches out to Stan's home and speaks with his wife. And ironically enough, that scene was on in the background. And Stan's wife confirms that he had taken his own life, the day before. So now everybody is fully aware, it's confirmed. Like, Stan is no longer with them. So after they get this information, Mike kind of says, like, "Look, man, I got a plan." And everybody, from this point, everybody kind of separates. Like, Bill sticks around, but everybody else kind of goes their own separate ways. And, that's just kind of how we wrap up Act 1. So, as the group returns to Derry, their memories do gradually begin coming back. And this makes it clear that, like, their forgetting stuff is kind of attached to the town. And, like, when they left, it's almost as if, like, oh, that might have been just a bad dream or something. But not even that. They just didn't remember it, period. So, like, Pennywise's influence seems connected to the town, as he has a chokehold on everyone. Like, he has them, like, in his grasp. But, like, yeah, once you leave, it kind of allows that grip to be broken, and you can bury those experiences. And the only issue with that, though, is it never really gets processed fully. So, there are these issues with that. So, whatever it may be, like, that's how we end kind of Act 1. Now, as everybody kind of disperse and moves about, we go into our next scene, or our next act, where you see a baseball game being played. And this is probably one of the movie's strongest, like, standalone Pennywise scenes, like, right here. Like, the scene under the bleachers at the baseball game. Like, Pennywise encounters a little girl named Victoria who has a birthmark on her face, and she's a little self-conscious about it. And this just shows that predatory approach that he has. Same thing that he used with Georgie back in the first movie. He comes off charismatic. Instead of chasing her or, immediately becoming a monster, Pennywise talks to her. He identifies her insecurities. He tells her exactly what she wants to hear. And then once that trust kind of is built, he attacks her. So this scene brings, like, Pennywise back to what made that Georgie sequence seem so effective. Like, because he's a predator. Like, that's what makes this scene effective, because Pennywise is often at his scariest when, the actor himself, Bill Skarsgård, is allowed to perform versus being surrounded by visual effects and CGI and everything. Instead of transforming into like a giant creature, like Pennywise calmly, studies Victoria's insecurities. He gains her trust and he manipulates her before attacking, breaking down that shield and showing that like Pennywise is a very intelligent predator that understands exactly how to exploit emotional vulnerabilities and then get what he wants from you. Like stuff like this can be more disturbing than the bigger monster sequences, because the tension really comes from Pennywise's personality. Like his ability to make someone feel safe before revealing, like, that he is a creature, that he is a monster, and like what he really wants. The scene also raises the question of whether this movie relied too heavily on spectacle, when like moments like this, like it gave Bill Skarsgård like an opportunity to kind of flex some of his strongest material as Pennywise. So I don't know. I that scene always stands out to me, but it also kind of plays back to the first movie as well with Georgie. So after everybody kind of disperse and make their ways, like Richie and Eddie, they decide to leave, and then Mike, he's talking to Bill and basically takes him back to his crib and shows him what's up. Bill stays with Mike, and he wants to hear him out, because remember, Bill still kind of has that guilt. So it's like, yeah, like let's fix this. Like he explains that he spent like years researching Pennywise, and he believes that he discovered a way to kill it permanently. Like, and I always think about this with like, having now seen Welcome to Derry, and then you see the first one. I was like, yeah, maybe it seems like each time you do this, yeah, maybe it's like playing Bowser's Fury on Nintendo Switch. Like, yeah, it seems like you might have beat him for now. And with the cycle being so long, of course, the last group will think, okay, we defeated him. And if you leave or you die or whatever, you're never going to really know the real answer. And you get Mike, who did stick around, so he does get the answer, because now he'll have this moment of seeing Pennywise twice. Well, all of them really. But yeah, Mike's basically on this journey of saying like, hey man, we can get rid of this dude like for good. So, Mike shows Bill the Ritual of Chüd, and he does also get Bill high as well. So, you have that. So we get flashback to when they were kids and in the clubhouse. You get all this nostalgia set in. Like the way they kind of play between the two, right? Like the present time and the flashbacks, I think are done very well as well. I think it does show like kind of a good parallel to the memories coming back and showing how they're able to start remembering. So I think all that is really well done as well. I think I said like back to back like a few times, and it's kind of weird. Sorry guys. But according to Mike, like for the ritual, each of them have, they've got to recover an artifact connected to the childhood during that summer. So, we'll go over those objects later on as we kind of talk about the ritual, but this gives like kind of the middle portion of the movie its structure. So each of them, they've got to go back into Derry alone and reconnect with something they forgot. And I think an important thing here too is when they do separate, this is when Pennywise is able to kind of strike, because they're strongest when they're together. But when they're separated, he can torment and torture them and really get into them. So, again, this part kind of gives the movie its heart, I guess, if you will. I don't want to say heart, but like it gives it the structure. And then also the ritual gives the losers a clear path. It gives them like a plan for defeating Pennywise, but also like kind of makes you like question like how much does Mike really understand about the ritual and whether his desperation makes him put too much faith in it, maybe. Like like Mike doesn't give all the details because I think if he tells like, hey, this shit failed at one point, like they're gonna be like, well, why the fuck are we gonna stick around and like what you want us to fail too? So like I don't, it gets weird there because I understand why he doesn't tell them, but at the same time, it's like you're kind of almost, if it's failed before, you're kind of leading your friends into a trap that they could also die in as well. So this kind of shows how his obsession with stopping Pennywise kind of affects his judgment. Like I think the ritual also expands the mythology surrounding it. Like it's weird. Pennywise, the entity, whatever it may be, but like it expands the mythology and it kind of gives you more about the creature's origin and the supernatural nature. Like I feel like explaining Pennywise makes the monster feel less mysterious, but it also kind of, well, I mean, when we get Welcome to Derry, it like this stuff here feels like, okay, you're taking away the scare factor, but then when you come back to Welcome to Derry, it's like, oh, it doesn't matter. You can explain all you want. This thing is still terrifying. Like, so there's kind of a weird line here. I think the book goes much further into the cosmic horror of it and the strange nature of it. And this leaves the movie somewhere between like kind of like, I don't want to say oversimplifying the mythology for the sake of the audience. And it also missed an opportunity to make Pennywise feel even more unknowable. So I don't know. It's a weird thing. I mean, again, still enjoyed it. It's just there are things when you watch something too much, you start to, I guess, overthink some of the stuff, perhaps. Also in all of this, like we have everyone together as Bev kind of explains, like she's seen all of them die. They conclude that she was able to see this due to the deadlights. And you get this, again, gnarly flashback of Bev getting hit with the deadlights and everything. So the flashbacks are helpful. It kind of, it pieces things together. Because in the last episode, I was saying like, man, this is weird. Like, I mean, they go away and they come back 27 years later. All that shit seems weird. I mean, it wasn't like, I think with the exception of Bev, because she went to stay with their aunt up in Portland. But like everyone else, should have still been kind of around. But yeah, these kind of flashbacks fill in those gaps. So as we kind of go into each of the losers on their individual journeys, like we start off with Bev, because she returns to the apartment that she stayed at with her father. And this is where she meets Mrs. Kirsch, the elderly woman who's living there now, who we do know from Welcome to Derry. And, she also witnessed Beverly seeing her mother die. And then this is kind of another one of those weird things, too, where, Beverly's there, look for her father. And then Mrs. Kirsch tells her, oh, no, he passed away as well. So this woman is kind of indirectly like connected to Bev, on the level of both her parents dying in some capacity. The scene kind of starts off quietly, again, you meet this old elderly lady, Mrs. Kirsch invites her in, says, come on, like have a seat and everything. And Bev's kind of like, nah, I really don't want to impose, and, things start to get a little bit more unsettling. Like, and then, Bev has a flashback to her father and he's discussing his, her mother's suicide and just, he was not a nice guy. Like every time I see that dude pop up on screen, like it just angers me. And then Mrs. Kirsch gets all weird and then, she drops the one line that, she says it in Welcome to Derry at the end. She says it here. No one who dies ever really stays ever really dies. No one in Derry, no one, anyone who dies in Derry never really stays dead or something to that effect. And then she hits her with this creepy smile, almost kind of like she went into like a Mitch McConnell kind of system reboot mode and just standing there. And then eventually the conversation turns towards her father. And then this was when Beverly kind of realized that, things aren't like, when I say her father, Mrs. Kirsch's father, Bob Gray, Pennywise the Dancing Clown. And this is kind of where Beverly realized that, oh shit, like things ain't what I thought they were. Mrs. Kirsch turns to a big giant titty creature, and Bev gets out. Well, before Bev gets out of there, she does recover the poem that she had hidden in her old bedroom. So, mission accomplished. So Beverly gets out of there, and when she gets out, she actually looks back at the building and realizes that the building's abandoned. So, none of that shit, all that shit was in her head anymore. Pennywise was, doing the Pennywise thing. But the important part of the sequence, wasn't the monster. It was Bev being forced back into this place where she experienced abuse as a child. So, like, this sequence kind of stands out, and a big part of what stands out is, like, again, CGI. I feel like the creatures and everything were like very CGI heavy. Maybe at its time it looked good. Probably, I don't know. Like now, I look back on it, I was like, ugh, that's a little rough. But like most of the horror that happens here comes before anything overly supernatural happens anyway. Like with Beverly returning to the apartment where she experienced the abuse as a child, there are the memories, the flashbacks and everything. So the location itself already carries fear and discomfort and fucked up memories. And then Mrs. Kirsch's, strange behavior, like, builds this tension, making the scene feel more unsettling. And then, by the time Beverly realizes something's wrong, shit's a little too late. Which I don't know if there's ever like a not too late moment with Pennywise, kind of pulling the strings. So, there's that. Then we jump to Richie, and with Richie there's a new factor added to his character in the story. But like Richie's artifact that he's searching for, through flashbacks, you go to the arcade, and this is where we learn that Richie is gay. I feel like the scene doesn't, it kind of alludes to it, but I don't think it like outright like makes it like, oh, this dude is gay, because Henry Bowers comes in and like Henry's little cousin even calls Richie gay, but they didn't say gay, they dropped that hard F word. But and I get it, it's meant to be, but I feel like it was kind of glossed over. At least that's the way I saw it. Because what I gathered from it was like, hey, he liked playing Street Fighter with this dude. Maybe a little too much. And he just wanted to play some more Street Fighter. That's how I looked at it. But, through the flashbacks, we learn that Richie is gay. And he spent, most of his life, hiding that part of himself. And Pennywise knows this. Well, I guess, like, in that scene, you don't get it. But, like, you do get it once Pennywise kind of, points it out. And takes advantage of this vulnerability. So rather than scaring Richie physically, Pennywise threatens to reveal this dirty little secret in, his little catchy little tune. And again, CGI heavy here with the Paul Bunyan statue. And it did startle me. I mean, the jump scare kind of caught me off guard, but it was still like, I don't know, CGI heavy and very weird. Richie's storyline adds a little bit more emotional depth by revealing like his constant humor. It's not just a personality trait, but it's, like we mentioned before, a defense mechanism that he uses to avoid, letting anybody in. So Pennywise targets that and tries to shame Richie rather than, using a traditional monster, because the thing Richie fears most is being exposed, and especially in '89, that was a big deal, So as a kid, that's something that he didn't want exposed. And, this kind of forces him to confront the feelings he's been hiding, particularly like, his sexuality and his feelings for Eddie, because you find this out later when he's carving, in the board, yeah, at the bridge. But, while, the movie could have developed this part, of Richie's character a little bit more, before the final reveal, it still gives his arc added weight and makes Pennywise feel more of a threat in that regard for him. And I don't even think his friends would even fucking care anyway. I think, there'd be some jokes, obviously, from Eddie, but they wouldn't fucking, give a rat's ass. But Pennywise plays off of, that emotional insecurity, and then kind of, that's his way of getting at Richie. So he ain't even got to really fucking do anything physically to that dude. He just has to threaten him with the idea that he's going to tell everybody. Like I said, I don't think his friends would care, but who knows? I mean, at this point, it's 27 years later. We're a more progressive time at that moment. And then we move on to Bill, and Bill actually finds his childhood bicycle at the antique shop that we do see featured in Welcome to Derry. Also, Rose, the indigenous woman, is running the shop then. But here, the shop owner is played by, or I don't know if it's the owner, but you have to assume, but he's played by Stephen King, and he recognizes Bill as an author, and he upcharges him on the bike because he knows he's a famous author. Like, Bill wants to buy the bike. He was like, yo, that's my childhood bike. He was like, well, you can pay for it. You're the famous author. And charge him $300 for it. And another, I guess, callback here is Bill sees that the owner is reading one of his books and asks if he'd like for him to sign it. And he declines it and says, nah, I didn't like the ending. Which is a callback from earlier in the movie when we first encounter Bill as an adult on the movie set, and it's kind of a running joke even with Stephen King's works as well. So Bill eventually purchases the bike, and he's hyped for it. He gets on it. You can see the bike is kind of shitty and falling apart. So, but it does play into his memories, and he remembers riding a bike and Bev on the back hanging on to him. So, there is some good that comes from it. $300 short, but still. Bill eventually returns to the house where he lived with Georgie and his family, and everything kind of pulls him back toward that guilt that he carried since his brother's death. Then he's near the storm drain. He kind of has the whole little encounter there with Pennywise at reaching in and everything, which I don't know, to me it would just never occur to me to reach into a storm drain, period. Doesn't matter. Even though we did have a friend that we did send in a storm drain when we were playing football on the street and the ball went down. We lured him into the store to go get it. It's kind of fucked up. But he was the smallest one, and he got the ball back. So we appreciate Cedric for that. We love you, dude. And then here, after he has the encounter with Pennywise in the storm drain, he meets Dean, the kid from the restaurant, from the Jaded Orient, and he warns Dean to stay away from the store. Like, he was like, look, man, like, he's talking about the voices and everything, and he was like, if you hear any voices from here, fucking bounce, run. And Dean says that he only hears the voices like from the bathtub. And that's where Bill kind of realized, like, oh shit, Pennywise is coming for this kid now. So he tells Dean, leave Derry. I don't care what you got to do. Lie to your parents, do something. Y'all got to get out of here. And this all kind of leads up to that funhouse sequence later on where Bill's trying to protect Dean, try to save him, but he's actually forced to watch Pennywise kill Dean through a glass barrier. It's pretty fucked up. So here we are again, 27 years later, and Pennywise kind of recreates that failure. Bill's greatest failure is like, look, you couldn't save Georgie, now you can't save Dean. Sucks to be you. Like, Bill's attempt to save Dean is equal to his efforts to save Georgie Like, and even as an adult, Bill still carries that belief that his brother's death was somehow his responsibility, which causes him to take on the burden of protecting everyone around him. Like, his guilt may actually be more powerful than his fear of Pennywise, itself, because it continues driving like his poor decisions, all this time later. And this kind of like gives the ideal that, he never fully healed after childhood, which I think all of them kind of suffer from this. So like the funhouse sequence reinforces this by placing Bill like kind of behind a barrier where he can't do anything. He can see Dean getting like put in harm's way, but he can't reach him. So again, this kind of recreates the same helplessness he's associated with his brother's death, for all his life, or I guess since his brother's death, really. So that's kind of fucked up, but whatever. Then we get to Ben. So as an adult, like Ben's response to the bullying and insecurities growing up, like basically he responds to this by completely reinventing himself. He became successful. He got physically fit. He became confident on the outside, at least it appears that way. But when he returns to Derry, like what comes out is like that the lonely kid from the first movie kind of still exists. And Pennywise gets that. Like Ben goes to, the town's high school and he finds his old yearbook page, which Beverly signed it. This was his artifact. She was the only person to sign his yearbook. And, he kind of briefly kind of recalls an experience when Pennywise taunted him and chased him through the school. And he basically kind of used Beverly as that form or shapeshifted to Beverly and kind of fucked with him and insulted him about his weight and loneliness and, just made things really, really uncomfortable for him. So like Ben's life kind of leads that ideal that like he's changed dramatically on outside. Like again, he's confident, he's successful, he's physically transformed, but many of those insecurities created by childhood bullying still kind of lays underneath, and he's probably never had to deal with those outside of where he was before. And like we mentioned, when you leave there, you kind of forget a lot of stuff, just that trance that the town has on you. And also, again, he probably just hasn't dealt with like the type of bullying that he encountered before. So, as he grew up and kind of escaped all of that, like much of who he becomes can kind of be seen as a response to that loneliness, that overweight kid that he once was. And that kind of brings up the question of whether he did he really get over those feelings, or did he just kind of build this identity around them? Like the sequel doesn't really give Ben as much material outside of his relationship with Beverly, so his story kind of remains kind of closely tied to the feelings he carried for her as a child. And I guess that does pay off later on. That kind of, I don't know. I guess with so many characters, not everyone's going to get to shine, right? So I guess it does make sense. Like even when you kind of look at them as kids, it's like, those that shine then kind of still shine now, in the later part of the story. So that also makes it worth, kind of wondering, whether like he still, loves, Beverly for who she is as an adult, or partly because she represents, one of the few positive connections that he had during that painful period of his childhood. So one can only wonder, I guess. Then we go to Eddie. He returns to the pharmacy and he kind of revisits memories surrounding illness, medication, and the leper that haunted him. So even though Eddie learned as a child that his mother had been manipulating him into believing that he was sick, you can tell that he never completely escaped that mentality as an adult. Because, that shit was going on for years. So it kind of becomes part of your personality, becomes your character. you know? So that makes sense as he becomes an adult and he works in risk management. You know, he married someone that's, again, just like his mother, like overly protective. And as I mentioned before, the same actress played his mom, also played his wife. So pretty funny. And Pennywise, he still knows, you know, he still knows that. You know, he still knows that disease and physical vulnerability are ways to kind of fuck with Eddie. So, you know, here Eddie goes to the pharmacy and he recovers an inhaler, and Pennywise pulls him right into a childhood nightmare where he sees his mother being tied up by the, by the leper in the basement. And, you know, he encounters the leper and manages to actually get the upper hand. And then the leper vomits all over him, and it kind of like force him to kind of run out of there, and he's covered in fucking puke, and it's a fucking nightmare. It's a shit show. But Eddie, I think, again, strong character, and the psychological fuckery that his mom played on, I think, makes that character so much more interesting to kind of play with, because the fears are a lot different than the others. Like the fears that were created for him were just that, they were created by his mom. Like, had his mom not fucked him up, he probably would have been chill. He would have been a great kid. Like, he would have been fun. He was already fun, but, you know, he wouldn't have been like overly protective. But I think that's also an important thing, you know, for the kids, I guess, to have someone that's that way, trying to look out for them to whatever degree. But you kind of see that, you know, Eddie never fully kind of gets away from that influence of his mother, like, just throughout life. You know, even though he learned, like, that she exaggerated all his illnesses and used fear to kind of keep him dependent on her, like, you know, again, he still kind of just built his life around that, avoiding risk. And maybe, you know, that defense mechanism kept him alive longer. Who knows? But either way, like, this kind of reflects how people can sometimes like kind of build a familiar relationship pattern, like unfortunately even like unhealthy ones, you know, because they feel just like, you know, it feels normal or predictable. And beneath all of Eddie's anxieties, he is like far braver than he believes. Like, you know, him returning to the pharmacy and the confrontation, you know, with the fears kind of tied to his childhood, kind of like they start to kind of push him toward realizing that. And you know, that kind of sets up his final act later on in the movie. Spoiler alert, he's going to die. But, you know, he steps up, and despite, you know, kind of always feeling like he's fragile and stuff, you know, he kind of throws himself out there to protect his friend. So to close out the second act, everyone's back at the hotel. Richie's attempting to leave. He doesn't really care about the curse or whatever the fuck is going on. But on his way out, he drives by the synagogue that Stanley used to attend, and he has a flashback to Stan's bar mitzvah. And, you know, that kind of gives him, I guess, that motivation to stick around. It's also is a way of keeping Stan kind of still part of the group in some capacity, and you know, lending motivation. Like, Bill and Bev, they see a skateboard roll down the stairs, and there's a message that's written on it in blood. You know, it said, "Won't be there for him either," referring to Dean. And then Bill takes off to try to save Dean, which I already mentioned. He fails. Upstairs, Eddie encounters Henry Bowers. Henry stabs him in the cheek. Eddie stabs him back. Like, he pulls the blade from his cheek and then stabs Henry Bowers in the chest. And, you know, he bounces out. Oh, and then Mike, can't forget Mike. During all of this, he's kind of haunted by his parents' death. You know, burning up and whatnot. And actually, in this, just kind of to wrap up Henry Bowers' part, Henry Bowers attacks Mike back at the library, and Richie uses a tomahawk to kill Henry. And yeah, that's it. Tomahawk to the head. And that was it. That's act 2. We out of here. Let's jump to act 3 real quick and try to wrap this son of a bitch up. Basically, Bill's kind of like fucking wrapped up in all this guilt, and then he fucking failed. He couldn't save Dean. He couldn't save Georgie. So he's like, look, I got to go back to Nybalt and fucking face Pennywise. I don't want to drag my friends into this. Like, I think in like the original one, he was like, look, y'all got to come with me. But in like the newer ones, well, I guess in chapter 1 also, he's kind of like, you guys got to come with me. But like more so here, because of all the guilt, he's like, I don't really want anybody with me. Like, I got to do this on my own. So like, it's kind of like this thing where he feel like he brought this on the others. Like, he brought them into this fight and he put them at risk. So he's like telling the others, like, stay away. But of course they're friends. They refuse and they follow him. And this kind of like gives Bill kind of that reminder that they're stronger together. So inside the house, Pennywise immediately, tries to divide them, because together they're strong, but separated, he can kind of fuck with them all individually. And he starts off by basically appearing as Stanley's severed head. And this kind of gives you like kind of a reminiscent of The Thing. John Carpenter's The Thing, where like the head basically becomes like a spider creature. And going after Richie, really. And there's even a part here where Richie is being attacked and Bill's trying to save him, and Eddie freezes up. Eddie will step up later, but in this moment he freezes up, and Bill fucking lashes out at him and was like, yo, like, you nearly got this dude killed. Like, essentially saying, quit being a bitch. But you have that, and then you got Ben, who's being fucking carved into by Pennywise. You see the reflection in the mirror, and instead of the kind of reminiscent to Henry Bowers trying to carve Henry in the stomach, it's Pennywise carving home into his stomach. Bev breaks the mirror. That sends Pennywise kind of scurrying. But again, Pennywise needs to get them all separated, so that does happen. In this way, he can kind of focus individually on all of them. So, Bill's instinct to go after Pennywise alone, it seems like, okay, he's doing the right thing, but really he's kind of fucking dumb. Like, he's being guided again by guilt. He's being guided by being guided to make poor decisions by, not being able to save his younger brother. Like, he repeatedly, like, kind of beats himself up for not being there, and like he's taking responsibility for protecting everyone around him, because he still believes that failing to save someone means he has somehow failed. Like it's a personal attack. Like he's fucking up personally. So in doing this, like, Bill kind of forgets that one of the most important things here, like, that you get from the first film is like, y'all got to stick together. Like you're strongest when you face Pennywise together. And again, Pennywise, he takes advantage of this. He benefits whatever the group separates, because isolation allows like it to focus on each person's individual fear without the support of the others, and making fear easier to manipulate and control them. So with their memories all kind of now fully restored, and they know what time it is, they know what's up, they basically get into Pennywise's lair, where Mike sets up the steps necessary for them to do the ritual. And this like includes them having to burn the artifacts, basically. Like they have all these things that, like I mentioned earlier, they were kind of going around town collecting. Like, Bill went and got the paper sailboat, that he gave to Georgie. Beverly uses the poem from Ben, I don't think she knows that's from Ben. I think there's like, yeah. But she gets the poem. Richie uses a game token from the arcade, and even here, like, Ed kind of, throws a joke at him. Tone's like, dude, that's gonna take forever to burn. And they kind of have like a little bicker back and forth. Ben uses that old yearbook page signed by Beverly as his artifact. Eddie uses his inhaler, which, I mean, even though Eddie's kind of going at Richie about his artifact, Richie kind of fires back and basically saying your shit's like going to take a long time too. And then for Mike, his artifact was the first stone thrown at the rock fight back at when they're kids. And that's an important thing because that's kind of what connected him to this group. So that makes perfect sense. So everybody has all their things. And then also Ed kind of points out that the rock won't burn either. And for good measure, Eddie then also throws in the shower cap from Stanley, because in one of the flashbacks, they all put on shower caps, and Stanley's like, it's to keep spiders out of your hair, where Richie's like, nobody's scared of spiders. And he turns around and everybody's wearing a shower cap. So he's like, I stand corrected. But yeah, basically everybody's got something in the container now, and Mike starts a ritual, and he instructs the others to start chanting. And during this point, the dead lights appear and kind of start making its way towards the pottery where all the items are being burned. And for a moment, it seems like, that shit's going to work. Then it doesn't. Like, the ritual failed, which I mentioned earlier. This shit's failed before. And Mike admits that, the people who previously attempted it, they were killed. And that he kept that information, from them because, like, if, like, he told them, they wouldn't believe. And the way that he looks at it is the others failed because they didn't believe. So if, like, the losers believed, he thought it would work. So basically from this point, Pennywise returns as a massive fucking spider-like creature and goes on a rampage and starts attacking. Yeah, basically, like, the ritual fell and kind of, again, brings up the thought about Mike's decision making, and how obsessed he is with, like, trying to get the thing done, that he's not even really thinking about his friends' like safety. Like, this desperation to destroy Pennywise makes his, like, it's kind of understandable, but it also kind of fucks with the trust within that group now. And it makes, like, it kind of makes almost like them hunting for the artifacts and going back and doing all this stuff. It almost kind of makes it feel like less meaningful. Like, once this shit fails, it's like all this work to get these things. And this was kind of like the heart of the story. Like, it was the middle part of the story. Like, it's given, like, time that's being used here, and then they get them in, and now the shit falls apart and it fails. So I don't know. I mean, I guess it still works, but if you're watching a bunch, you start overthinking that shit. You start to wonder, man, that shit sucks. But final confrontation, kind of shifts things heavily, towards spectacle as well, because you get that giant CGI spider. And, like, again, Pennywise, I think, serves more purpose when he's just, when you're letting Bill Skarsgård really kind of shine and be him. Like, the design kind of, they did, because you got to kind of emphasize this creature's supernatural, like, abilities, I guess, in that it can expand and grow, and it makes Pennywise physically larger. And I think to some degree, as a moviegoer, it makes him less frightening. But it's not about us; it's about people in the movie. You see a giant spider like that, it shit is going to be terrifying. But I think as we watch it and we see the CGI, it does become a little sloppy in that regard. And since you have this, I don't know, I even kind of feel like even in this one, you get not as much Skarsgård as Pennywise. You get the Bob Gray scene, you get the scene under the bleachers. You get these little things, and those were really like standout points. But like everything else, I feel like with him was like heavily CGI, and it was just like kind of takes away from it a little bit, just a little bit. So yeah, like as I mentioned earlier, kind of getting everybody separated because that's how Pennywise, kind of he's going to be stronger against you if you're separated. So like during this final confrontation again, you got Bill, and he's forced back into this situation where he's talking with, or I guess he's really seeing younger him talk to younger Georgie, and Georgie basically was like, look, I know that you lied. You said you were sick. And, Bill was like, yeah, I just didn't want to play with you that day. And, he starts repeating, you lied and I died. You lied and I died. And, kind of kept going with that. But I think in this, though, he does finally kind of accept that Georgie's death wasn't like something he could have prevented simply by, being a better brother. I think for Bill, like defeating Pennywise, meant that he would have to give up that belief. He had to give up the belief that everything was his fault. So, there's kind of like some growth there. You have to find yourself in this moment. So you have that. You have Ben and Beverly. They kind of get separated. Beverly gets kind of sent back to the bathroom stall, and like it fills up with blood and everything. Because during her story when she was younger, she's going through those physical changes as a young lady, and those were part of those anxieties. So they're like kind of Ben and Beverly are separated, but they're able to kind of communicate a little bit, like. And I think part of what it was, like, Ben is like, as he's being buried alive and isolated by himself in loneliness, he starts reciting a poem, and then Bev hears it, and they again, they connect, they unite, and they're able to kind of get out of the shit themselves. So this part is less about Pennywise and more about finally recognizing, the feelings there. I think is also super convenient now. It's like she didn't like him back then. At least I think she was more into Bill, but now he's like super hot, and it's like, oh, I think I'm into you now. Because like when he's getting carved up, like you can see all the abs just popping. It's like, convenient now that you got like an 8-pack. Like now she likes you. Typical. And I don't know. I'm just fucking around. I don't really mean that. And then, we got Richie. And Richie actually gets exposed to the deadlights, and he's pretty helpless. And then this is where Eddie kind of jumps in and takes one for the team. He sacrificed himself for Richie. So, yeah, you have like this emotional confrontation through all of this. Like all these like emotional confrontations are more important than the physical battle itself with Pennywise, because this is really forcing them to deal with something within themselves, to face the trauma that they've carried since childhood. Like, you get to this point where Bill finally kind of gets over the guilt of, Georgie dying and accepting that his brother's death wasn't something that he could have prevented. You got Ben and Beverly, confronting their feelings that I guess remained unresolved for all this time, and they finally acknowledged their connection to one another. And then, like, I guess out of everyone, Bill kind of gets the clearest emotional resolution, because I think the Ben and Beverly thing, I don't know, that felt a little like, I don't, it was weird, but I think Bill's was very direct and very clear. Like you get the resolution, because his entire life, his entire story has been driven by Georgie. I mean, you can argue that like all of them again are in this because Georgie died, and Bill was like, yo, y'all got to ride with me. So I think he had like the cleanest, like clearest resolution. And even though like Richie and Eddie ultimately like they kind of provide like a big emotional payoff because of Eddie sacrificing himself. Like, I mean, I think, Bill's thing kind of still was the clearest line. With that being what it is, the Ben and Bev romance kind of gives both characters their closure, though. Even like if the relationship sometimes like felt less developed, because again, it was weird. Like, just kind of weird. And I think there's other emotional parts of the story that probably just paid off more. So overall, like, the film attempts to resolve each of their traumas, but with so many characters and storylines like kind of competing for attention, some of those like resolutions feel more like, or less complete, and more like just like just kind of a quick like wrap up, quick bow on it, and we kind of move on from it. Like, excuse me, like kind of going back to Eddie and Richie, and how Eddie kind of sacrifices himself. Like, Eddie's final attack on Pennywise kind of completes his character arc by proving that he was never as weak or as helpless as he had been taught to believe. Like, his mother spent, all of his childhood convincing him that he was sick, that he was fragile, that he was constantly in danger. And, traces of that kind of followed him into adulthood. Well, not kind of, it fucking did. It shaped who he became. And when he sees his homie being threatened, Eddie was like, nah, fuck all that noise. And without allowing any anxiety to kind of get in the way and to control him, like, he put himself in danger to protect someone that, he really fucking loved. That's his dude. Like, all the jokes and shit, but it's still your dude. And his death kind of gives that moment like a tragic weight, but it also shows that Eddie ultimately rejects the identity that was created for him, by his mom, and discovers his own courage. So, like, his journey, like, I guess, I mean, Bill was very clear. I guess Eddie's was pretty clear as well. Like it, like, his journey kind of moved from fear, independence, to bravery and self-sacrifice. Like, Eddie, I think, has also, I guess, yeah, I guess he and Bill are kind of even in that regard, where they do have like the two strongest and most complete character arcs in the terms of like the sequel. And like, Eddie's death kind of changes Richie. It fucks with him. For most of the movie, Richie, he uses humor to keep his emotions at, a safe distance. And there's, nothing funny here about losing Eddie. Like, when everything's all said and done, after they defeat Pennywise, which I'll get to that in a second, like, he wants to bring Eddie's body with them, like, as the lairs collapsing, but the others, weren't, like, they eventually force him to leave. They say something like, dog, he's dead. So, that's just, again, kind of that fucked up thing there. And it changes them. And like, later on, you see Richie return to the Kissing Bridge, and, he retraces the initials he carved there when he was a kid, R+E, and, that was basically, the secret that Pennywise tried to use against him, because, he loved Eddie. And, that, becomes something that Richie finally acknowledges. So Richie's grief over Eddie becomes one of the other emotional anchors of the final act, because it forces him to confront those feelings that he spent most of his life kind of hiding behind, like, hiding, using humor to hide behind, I should say. And Bill Hader gives like the character like a good amount of like vulnerability, like especially once Richie loses like the person he cared about most. But like the movie does leave out some of their like it leaves like the relationship kind of underdeveloped. But again, you got a lot of characters, so you can't kind of fucking put it all. There's so much. I think the movie is like 2 hours and 40 minutes, so you really we're not in the days of like, I guess Avengers did come out, Endgame came out, so we were doing 3 hour movies, but not for this though. But yeah, this does kind of goes underdeveloped before Eddie's death, like, and Richie returning to the bridge and retracing the initials. It is important because it shows like that again. He finally acknowledged what Eddie meant to him, rather than burying those feelings again. So in that sense, Richie's story, like the real victory here over Pennywise is that it's like, look, you can fucking tell people if you want. I'm not scared of you. I'm not scared of people knowing. And, him accepting a part of himself that fear and shame kind of kept hidden for years. So I still think, Bill and Eddie's kind of like resolutions were stronger. And this is strong too. But I think those are like kind of more tangible to a degree, I guess, like more like on the surface. Whereas like this one, you get it like on your second watch, you're like, oh, now I get it type deal. Now, as far as Pennywise being killed, even though the ritual doesn't work, it doesn't defeat Pennywise like Mike had anticipated, or at least hoped it would with this group. The one thing that does work is like they realize like his power depends on, or its power depends on their fear of it. So, they spent their entire lives like believing Pennywise is this big, enormous, unstoppable monster. And they just stopped believing it. They stopped giving that power to Pennywise. They surround Pennywise and they just basically like start insulting them, saying like, you're just a clown, you're weak, like you're nothing. They reduce like Pennywise, like they reduce it, I guess, or the entity, like down to like this emotionally like fragile thing, until like Pennywise is literally like shrinking, physically shrinking. And then they end up basically picking up the heart and crushing it. So the ideal behind Pennywise's defeat works thematically because the losers finally understand that, much of the power that comes from, for the creature comes from the fear that they gave it. By refusing to see Pennywise as an unstoppable monster, they actually change what it represents to them and strip away that control. And, this was something that stuck there since childhood. And that's why Pennywise physically shrinks. As the losers stop fearing it, the creature becomes weaker, smaller, and eventually kind of scared itself. So the concept is strong because Pennywise is forced to experience the same fear it spent generations creating, for others. And although the execution, it came across as unintentionally funny when the group essentially, starts like insulting it and throwing names at it, like as a final death, it makes sense, within the movie's themes, like even if the actual scene may not feel as frightening or satisfying as, the ideal behind it. So there you go. You got kind of that ending that's wrapped up. And then, as we exit our third act and, we get into them kind of getting out of there and leaving the sewers. Everybody's out except for Eddie. They eventually return to the quarry where they spent time together as children. And kind of for a moment, as adults, as, kind of both the adulthood and childhood seem to overlap, they've returned to the place where their friendship formed. But they're no longer the people that they were 27 years earlier. So the return to the quarry gives that, surviving group a chance to reconnect with the place that once represented friendship, freedom, and safety and belonging during their childhood. This moment works as kind of both nostalgia and closure, because they are revisiting an important memory without Pennywise controlling how they experience it. Like, after spending so much of the movie kind of dealing with memories tied to fear and trauma, like the quarry now allows them to reclaim part of like their past, and not have Pennywise a part of it. Like, this is like their story now. This is their past, and it doesn't it doesn't belong to Pennywise. He has no power over them. So as this kind of all wraps up, the survivors, they kind of start going back to their lives, but it's different now. They remember, they have those memories, and for better or for worse, Ben and Beverly, they begin a relationship, and they finally again acknowledge their feelings for each other. And again, kind of a weird thing, but again, it's fine. Bill, he goes back to writing, and the man constantly criticized for bad endings finally reached the end of a story that he never finished. So, now, there's like a confidence there with him. Richie returns to the bridge again, kind of retraces the initials. And Mike, who's, I guess the most important in all of this, to be quite honest, because he stuck around. Like, he finally leaves Derry. So for 27 years, this dude stayed behind because someone needed to. And now that Pennywise is gone, seemingly, like, for the first time, Mike can leave now. So I think in the flashback, they're talking about he wanted to go to Florida. So, that's it. And then we also get the letters. Stanley wrote letters to everyone. And he explained, like, right before he killed himself, like, he explains that he knew that he wouldn't be able to face Pennywise again. And he also believed his fear will weaken the group. So, like, the movie kind of presents this decision as a sacrifice intended to help the others stay together. So, like, it's clearly meant to be emotional. But it's also one of the most kind of complicated choices of the movie. But I get it. Because, again, if he's there, that kind of, like, he thinks that, like, basically he's too scared to go back. And if he doesn't go back, it's not going to work because there's a link that still exists out there and they need to all be together. So if he's not there, then, it can kind of go on its own. So real quick, I'll go through the themes and then kind of wrap up because this is at 90 minutes now. This is longer than I'd like to do these solo episodes. But I guess this is starting to become more of a thing. I need to start reaching out to people and stop being a fucking, like, I'm not inconveniencing you guys. You guys want to do this. So we'll see how True Blood goes. Because that's a big boy and that's a long one. But either way, some of the themes that we deal with here, like the adult losers, like one of the things that you kind of get here is like, yes, they physically left Derry, but they never really left Derry. Or Derry never left. It's like that joke. It's like, you can take the boy out of the trailer park, but you can't take the trailer park out of the boy. Looking at you, Eminem. Bill kind of hangs on to that guilt and responsibility. Beverly with the abusive relationships and fear. Ben with his insecurities and loneliness. Richie with using his humor as a protection and then kind of a shield to his fears and vulnerabilities. Eddie with anxiety and dependence and fear of illness and just catastrophe. Mike has this obsession and responsibility to the others and Stan his fear of confronting the past. So, those memories disappeared, but the effects, they still remained. So, you have that. As far as like themes, you got memory and forgetting. Memory is kind of a central point to this movie. Like, they all escaped Derry partly because they forgot it. But that forgetting also meant that they never fully understood why they became the adults that they became. So returning to Derry is like a painful reminder of all of that. You know, it like it forces them to remember. And at the end, like the memories remain, but it's changed now because they're able to confront a lot of it. So, you know, at this point, like the memory, you know, remembering it doesn't like hurt them now. It doesn't destroy them. Fear, you know, changes as we get older. So in the first film, like Pennywise gives very direct childhood fears: disease, clowns, monsters, dead relatives, abusive parents. Whereas the sequel has a harder job because adult fear is often a little bit more complicated. So you got regret, you got shame, you got failure, you got identity, you got relationships. Repeating the mistakes of the past, you got losing people. Like when you grow up, your fears become so much more like complicated, but it does still kind of trace back to those younger things. It's just that there's more depth to them. So, you know, the strongest parts of this movie, they're usually the moments when Pennywise understands the difference between childhood fears versus adult fears. And I think that shit's fucking great. I think it's brilliant. So rock on. Bill Skarsgård as Pennywise, bigger isn't always better. I think with the sequel, you know, they used the character differently. The first film really relied on mystery. But by the time we get to the second one, you know, the audience kind of already knows what Pennywise looks like, knows what Pennywise is. So the sequel kind of attempts to make the creature like bigger, louder, more like elaborate, I guess. And that doesn't necessarily make Pennywise more frightening. You know, some of the best parts, you know, in the second movie is where, you know, Pennywise is just Pennywise. You know, he's smaller. You know, he's just, you know, you're allowing Skarsgård to kind of act at this point. You know, the conversation beneath the bleachers works because Pennywise simply just talks. You know, the Mrs. Kirsch stuff that works before the monster transformation. You know, the Georgie stuff works because Pennywise kind of could tap into Bill's guilt. You know, you didn't need like CGI and big creature effects to build off of that. And then you also have that cycle of violence within Derry. Like the movie starts off with people attacking, you know, a gay couple. And Pennywise doesn't make them do it. You know, this is just people being ignorant. Like that distinction is very important because people are doing fucked up things and Pennywise is just feeding off of it. But I think, again, like I said, I think Pennywise is a disease to Derry. So he may not make them do the bad things, but it's almost kind of like, it's like kind of making it seem like it's okay to do the bad things, even though they don't know that Pennywise is there. So yeah, it's definitely very complicated, I guess, this like cycle of violence. But, you know, I guess the question does kind of still stand, you know, whether Pennywise created Derry's darkness or just discover that this was the perfect place to feed. So you have, you know, just that to kind of wrap on. So I guess I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up because now we're running long. I still got more notes and there's a lot more here. Jeez Louise. You got to chill, Dante. You got to chill. So that's it. I'm going to wrap up. It chapter 2, and then this stretch of episodes exploring, you know, Derry in itself. The first film kind of introduced us to the kids, and it let us discover the fears that, you know, becomes easier to face, you know, when you're not facing it alone. You know, now you jump 27 years later, and those kids, they grew up, and, you know, they forgot about all those things. But, you know, forgetting didn't erase what happened to them. So coming back to Derry kind of forces them to remember, you know, all the things that were, you know, the people that they were, you know, the things that survived, and the way those experiences kind of continue to shape their lives. So, you know, when you look at the two films, they definitely flow together. You know, they grew together. And then like Pennywise, you know, is the monster that they come back to kind of defeat. But the real, like, I guess, battle that they're up against, you know, that they spent 27 years trying not to remember is really, you know, just that, you know, their traumas. So, you know, at this time when, you know, the losers leave, like they leave like completed, I guess. You know, again, they face those traumas, they face those fears, and they kick the shit out of it. So there you have it. Those two movies. You know, I know like reviews for the second one weren't necessarily the best, but I think when you really look at it like from that perspective, like looking at those themes, it does make sense. It does work, and it's perfect. So that's it. That's what I'm gonna leave y'all on. So as always, to you guys, the listeners, thank you so much. Thank you. We do appreciate you. If you have any questions or concerns or criticisms, always feel free to reach out. You can find me at So You Like Horror on Instagram, all the words separated by _ So You Like Horror. And you can email me. I begin like those fake AI emails. Those shits are trash. So if that's you, don't do it. Don't do it. Just send me like a legit email, or really just send me a DM on fucking Instagram. I'll actually answer that. I did do a poll on Instagram for the theme for 2027. We're gonna do children in horror, aka fuck them kids. And I really wanted to do horror comic books, but it barely lost. So I'm still gonna do a couple comic book joints for 2027, but we do have our theme for next year. I'm just going to put together the list of movies and then what have you, and then we'll kind of go from there. But thank you so much. We love you guys. Y'all know what it is. You guys keep listening. We're going to definitely keep making these shows. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
I think that's good for now.
The end.